With a win this week, the worst the Wolverines will do is the Rose Bowl. I'll explain next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it, and a touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. The Wolverines back at it after a much-needed and deserved bye, taking on the Penn State Nittany Lions, who are still kind of hanging around the Big Ten East race. You know, they're only one game out, but the problem is they lost that game to Ohio State, so they kind of need several, kooky tiebreaker things to happen. But at the very least, a New Year's Six bowl game is within striking distance for Penn State, and the same could be said for Michigan. If the Wolverines win on Saturday, and given the next two games are against two of the weaker teams in the Big Ten, Rutgers clearly the weakest, and Indiana at home, you're looking at a 10-1 start. And I think no matter what happens against Ohio State, if Michigan wins on Saturday against Penn State, the absolute worst Michigan's going to do is the Rose Bowl, or some other commiserate New Year's Six bowl game if they were to miss out on the playoff because, say, Ohio State went from the Big Ten instead. And when you look at, the way this season started with the dispiriting loss at Notre Dame, the way that this team has rebounded, established itself, if I had have told you, I think it's the worst case scenario is Michigan goes back to Pasadena for the first time in over a decade. I mean, we all would have taken that absolutely sight unseen. So this Michigan team is finally delivering on the potential and the promise. And isn't it ironic, we're hearing, Harbaugh to Cleveland. Has there ever been a football coach ever who has had the same media tell us he sucks, he's overrated, and can't win big games? And yet he's leaving for every job at the highest level of football. How can both of those things be true? Why does the NFL want such an overrated, crappy, overpaid coach? Does anybody know? Why would the NFL want that guy? Seemingly every NFL franchise wants a guy that we're told is the most overrated coach in all of college football. That doesn't make sense to me, but self-awareness is dead. It is 2018 after all. So what does Michigan need to do against Penn State on Saturday? Well, we'll talk more about this with Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor and Wolverine Digest coming up in the next segment of the show. But I think it really comes down to this for Michigan. Play football. If this is an actual football game, the Wolverines are too strong in the trenches. And over the course of time, as we've seen them do to several teams already this season, they will wear them down like a little anaconda style and squeeze the will out of them and, likely end up pulling away in the fourth quarter because they're stronger on both sides of the line of scrimmage. But if they let Trace McSorley turn it into a sandlot, play a little street ball, and get this to a game where, maybe Penn State doesn't do much for 75, 80% of their plays, but those other 10 to 20% of their plays, they're able to make a few big plays, like they did to us last year in Happy Valley, then absolutely there is still enough firepower here, even without Saquon Barkley, even without Mike Gesicki, even without Deshaun Hamilton. There is still enough firepower here with that quarterback and Trace McSorley to come in and steal this game from the Wolverines. But I love the way that this schedule sets up for Michigan. And, there's three reasons why. I think this November, these Wolverines will close the sale and finish the race that the 2016 Wolverines that were in the thick of the playoff hunt couldn't back in 2 years ago. And here are those three reasons. Number one, the schedule. In 2016, Michigan's two tough games in the month of November were both on the road. Two of the traditionally toughest places to play in our conference. The Horseshoe is one, and then Iowa City is the other. Well, this year, the other tough game in November, Michigan gets Penn State at home. So they don't have to play both of the difficult November games on the road. That's one plus. And plus, use that word again, the game at Ohio State, Michigan will go into that game having already played two rivalry games on the road at Michigan State and at Notre Dame. So that would better prepare them for the environment they're going to face in Columbus. The other reason I think this November will turn out better than November did 2 years ago when Michigan blew that opportunity to close the sale, the quarterbacks. It's not just one, but two. Remember, Wilton Speight was playing really good football. He ended up being third team All Big Ten in 2016, but he just wasn't the same after hurting that shoulder against Iowa. We had to rush him back early for that Ohio State game because we gave John O'Korn a go in the Indiana game, and it was clear he just could not run this offense. So we had to go to C-Bus with a guy operating at about 75-80% at best as our starting quarterback. Well, this year we have Shea Patterson, who I think is more physically gifted than Wilton Speight anyway. But behind him, if you had to go to Dylan McCaffrey, based on what we've seen, would you really think there'd be that big of a drop-off? I don't think so. And I love Shea Patterson. He reminds me so much of his coach when he played for Michigan, and he was one of my, if not my favorite player growing up. But I don't think there's that big of a drop-off between Shea Patterson and Dylan McCaffrey. Certainly nothing like the drop-off between Wilton Speight and John O'Korn 2 years ago. So I think that's the second reason this November will turn out better than the November of 2016 did. And here's the third. You've got a bell cow and you've got blocking. I loved De'Veon Smith as a player. He gave us everything he had, and he had one of the greatest touchdown runs I've ever seen from a Wolverine against BYU in 2015. But he was more of an effort guy than a gifted guy. I think Karan Higdon brings a level of explosiveness that you just never saw from De'Veon Smith. And right now he's on pace to do something no Michigan running back has done since Mike Hart was setting the all-time rushing record here in Ann Arbor with his consecutive 100-yard rushing streak. And then that goes to the offensive line. The offensive line the last few years here just has not been able to close out games. We just didn't see the victory formation, that first down we had to have, that 4-minute drive that winds down the clock. Well, this year, as this offensive line has gotten stronger and stronger as the year has gone on, we have begun to see that boot to the throat and squeeze them by the nether regions when it counts the most at the end. Killer instinct from this offensive line. So a more favorable schedule with at least one of those two tough games in November at home, better quarterback play, and we have a punishing running game that we didn't have 2 years ago. And it's why I think these Wolverines will finish what the 2016 team, for all of its talent, couldn't. And I think we will be celebrating when this month comes to an end. Go Blue. Want to say thank you. We've landed several new Patreon supporters at Michigan Podcast since the season started. Thank you to those of you that are supporting us. And if you would like to, we want you to know that you get some exclusive content that we provide for you each week via Patreon, including my instant reaction post-game podcast, my picks for the Michigan game, pre-kickoff, and more, as a thank you to those of you that decide that you like what we do here at Michigan Podcast enough to support us at Patreon. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. All right, back here on Michigan Podcast, and my partner at Wolverine Digest, Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor, joins me now. Michael, good to see you, brother. How are you?
Doing fantastic, guys. Definitely been enjoying this bye week and ready for some more football.
Nothing like your team being on a bye when you're in the playoff hunt and you watch 8 ranked teams lose to unranked teams in the same weekend and know you're totally immune from all the carnage. Isn't that a ton of fun as a college football fan?
It is. It's certainly last weekend. I wondered why I enjoyed it so much without Michigan playing, but what you just said, I mean, all those teams going down and knowing that your team was resting comfortably at home, maybe going out for some Halloween parties, but definitely just enjoying themselves. And, now it's like if you can get past this weekend against Penn State, and the big games that are on the schedule this weekend with LSU, Alabama, and Georgia, Kentucky, and Northwestern Iowa, Northwestern Notre Dame. You're looking at a weekend where if you get by Penn State, you can rest easy for the next 3 weeks.
So, Michael, let me throw a number at you, and I just want to get your instant reaction, okay?
Okay.
29. That's how many teams, ranked teams, have lost to unranked teams already this season. 29. That says what to you?
That says I'm glad Michigan plays a ranked team this weekend. You know what? I think at the end of the day, I mean, we've seen winning on the road is hard. I wonder how many of those games have been on the road. I would bet more than half have been on the road. I think when you look at it, I wonder too a little bit, Steve, how much of it is looking at teams in the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season where you just don't know how good they really are.
Right.
And all of a sudden they face their first real competition. Now, that said, over the weekend, I mean, you had Washington losing to Cal in a 12-10 game, which is completely surprising. But I think those are more the anomaly games, and more so you're looking at not really sure what these teams are in the first couple of weeks, if they're going on the road. And certainly parity today is what it is, and you can beat anybody on any given day to some extent. But no, I look at it more like, I'd like to know a little more about those numbers. How many were on the road? How many were in the first 6 weeks of the season when you're still trying to figure out what you have coming back here?
So I know you probably did a little recon on the other teams in the Big Ten that did play over the weekend. Not the least of which is our next opponent this weekend, Penn State, which beat Iowa in a game where there were 54 combined points. Iowa should have gotten over 30 points too. They were on the 2-yard line on a 1st and goal and just had a brain fart in a game that was a series of brain farts for them. But the Hawkeyes scored 24 points without scoring any points on offense. Penn State put up 30 points on a really good Iowa defense with less than 400 yards of offense. What was your read of Penn State coming out of that game and what you take away from that heading into this week's clash with the Nittany Lions?
Similar to what I've always known about Penn State, and that they just seem to be one of those teams that finds a way to win some games. And in the last couple of years, they've had Saquon Barkley and dominating for them, and they've had some really good talent. This year, they don't have that type of talent. I mean, Miles Sanders, I like as a running back. I like KJ Hamler. I really like Trace McSorley. I mean, when you've got a quarterback, and how many times can we go through the history of Michigan football specifically, Steve? But if we go through and look at great football teams over the last 20 years, how many times do they have a special quarterback under center? And right now, Trace McSorley gives Penn State a chance in every game that he plays in. And he's banged up a little bit. He got hurt his knee on Saturday against Iowa. He's not thrown the ball as efficiently as he did the last couple of years. Doesn't have quite the weapons, as we said, down the field. But when I look at it, Trace McSorley, I go back to, honestly, 1995, 96, when Northwestern all of a sudden decided to be a team. And Steve Schnurr was this quarterback that was the best quarterback they'd had in 40 years. All of a sudden, Iowa came on the scene, and they had a guy named Brad Banks.
Yep.
And Illinois was good for a couple of years when they had a guy named Juice Isaiah Williams. I mean, every time that you look at some of these teams and their success rate, you go back to, okay, look at the quarterback. If they've had a special talent at quarterback, then they're pretty good. And that's what Penn State's had the last couple of years with Trace McSorley. And so nothing really changed from what I saw on Saturdays. I think Trace McSorley was a better quarterback than Nate Stanley, and that's what gave them the edge. And I think this weekend, maybe for the first time in this Penn State series in the last couple of years, Michigan, at least it appears to me, has the better quarterback. Not by much, because I think Trace McSorley is really good. But the last couple of weeks, beating Michigan State, Michigan had the better quarterback. Beating Wisconsin, Michigan had the better quarterback. It's a lot more complicated than that. But if you have the better quarterback, you really almost always have a chance to put your team in a position to win at the end. And that's what Penn State's done for the last 2.5 years.
A couple of blasts from the past there you had in that answer. You mentioned Steve Schnurr, who's the quarterback in those Northwestern teams that went to the Rose Bowl with Darnell Autry and Dwayne Bates and Gary Barnett. And Pat Fitzgerald was a 2-time National Defensive Player of the Year on those teams. I would argue the 4 best zone read quarterbacks I ever saw. I put Tim Tebow up there, obviously. I would put Pat White up there.
Zach Kustok? Is that where you're going with this?
What's that?
Zach Kustok? Is that where you're going with this?
No, I think Juice Williams is in that conversation.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
yeah.
that was a 2-man team. It was him and Richard Mendenhall, and they zone read the Big Ten all the way to the Rose Bowl that year. So that was a nice pull. Let's come back to Penn State in a second. Talk about a team that we didn't get a chance to scout over the weekend because they had a bye week as well, but they are now looming on the schedule as we approach November, and that's Ohio State. And I know there's a conventional wisdom out there that says, well, that game against Purdue was their perennial brain fart, like, when they had the 5 interceptions against Iowa and when they didn't give the ball to Ezekiel Elliott in 2015. I'm not so sure about that, and here's why. To me, I thought what we saw was things we've been seeing since week 1 come home to roost. I go back to the very first week of the year. Oregon State had over 400 yards of offense on them, a 78-yard touchdown. TCU had a 93-yard touchdown on them. Defensively, their numbers are way down compared to what we are used to seeing. They're giving up big plays in bunches. They played where I really got concerned about their defense is when they played Tulane, a triple option offense about a month ago, and a starting linebacker didn't record a single tackle in the game. And the reason why that got me concerned is because when you're playing a triple option team, they do make you play in a box, which is what most Big Ten teams want to do, but you have to play in a box in space because it's assignment football. And when you're starting linebackers in space are not able to make tackles against an offense that's coming often right at them, that has me really concerned. And I also don't think Dwayne Haskins, who to me has number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft kind of talent, but I don't think he's a fit for their offense. To me, it kind of reminds me of Christian Hackenberg at James Franklin. It's not a marriage. Trace McSorley and Tate Martell are better fits. And I told you when they brought Urban Meyer back, Michael, I would be fascinated to see. He has built his career on power spread. All right? And if the quarterback is not a threat in that power spread, whether it's Alex Smith, Tim Tebow, or JT Barnett, then when you run that RPO action, the quarterback can't run, so you've got him outnumbered. They don't have enough blockers for the guys you have in the box, and I think that has trickled down to what we haven't seen from J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber, who I thought maybe were the 2 best running backs returning in the Big Ten on the same team, other than Jonathan Taylor, and they've done almost nothing this year. I think they have some systemic problems. Is the systemic problems a team with that much talent could have, but I don't believe this was just the yearly aberration at all.
No, I think you could be right there, Steve, and you brought up a lot of really good points. And when you're a quarterback, and I get together a couple times a week, every week with Devin Gardner, who ran the read option underneath Rich Rodriguez, and then a little bit underneath Brady Hoke when they transitioned into that kind of different hybrid offense. And he talks all the time with Shea Patterson how important it's been the last couple of weeks, starting with Maryland, for Shea Patterson to become a threat in the read option running game, because when he's not and linebackers don't respect him, then they really really crash the middle, and they make it that much harder for your running back to get going. And if you're Ohio State and Dwayne Haskins does not run the football very much on those read option plays, well, then you're not respecting him. Your outside linebackers can crash in. Your safeties don't have to worry about a guy coming around the edge. They can crash in, and now you're letting your defensive linemen, especially your edge guys who have to have containment, you're allowing those guys to crash in, and that's making it very difficult for J.K. Dobbins and Mikey Weber to find the same consistent running room that they have the last couple years when they had J.T. Barrett. And no, I think you're right. I mean, I remember back to like the Rich Rodriguez days before Pat White, and he used to talk about, and we thought we were going to see this when he came to Michigan and he had Stephen 3, was he was going to throw the ball 40 times a game and run a spread with a dominant passing game. And Rich Rodriguez didn't become Rich Rodriguez until Pat White and Steve Slayton. And once he had those guys, that's when it really took off. And I think the same thing is true of Urban Meyer. You're dead on. I mean, J.T. Barrett and Tim Tebow put up big-time numbers in the passing game, but only because of how successful they were as runners and what that allowed them to do in terms of bringing those safeties in the box, in terms of getting those linebackers always to take their first step going forward. And so I think you're right about that on offense. And then you hit the nail right on the head. This is the worst core of linebackers I've ever seen at Ohio State since I've been paying attention, since the John Cooper era. I mean, you go back through the years and you talk about Katzenmoyer, and you go through the Laurinaitis, and you go through Jerome Baker the last couple. You go through the list of linebackers that Ohio State has, and it is All-American after All-American after All-American. And I'm telling you what, right now, when I look at these three linebackers for Ohio State, I don't think any of them start on Michigan. I don't think any of them start on the 3 or 4 best teams in the Big Ten right now. And that's really saying something. I mean, they don't make plays in space. They're not very good in terms of tacklers. They don't seem like they can cover very well. There's nobody here that's a risk to me if I'm a quarterback, and without Nick Bosa on the field anymore. And I know Chase Young is doing some good things for them, and they've got some interior guys that they like. But if I'm Shea Patterson, I'm dropping back to pass. There's not a single one of those linebackers that I'm accounting for before my pre-snap read saying, I got to be aware that this guy might come after me. I just don't think they're as athletic or as talented as they have been for, essentially the last 15 to 18 years. And that's really creating problems because Ohio State, as good as they've had the defensive backfield the last couple of years, and let's face it, they've been really good there too.
Sure. But
if they're not putting pressure, and if they're giving away some of that underneath stuff, and if they're not making, if second level, this is the big thing for me, and this is what excites me about this Michigan game against them, is Michigan is success when it comes to Karan Higdon's big runs for the most part this season have all been times where Michigan's been able to get a pulling guard or a tight end on the second level and take out that backside and front side linebacker, and that's led to the big runs against Northwestern, the big runs against Maryland, the big runs against Nebraska and SMU, and every team that we've seen so far this year, even Wisconsin. And I think this is a group of linebackers that are going to make it, I won't say easy, but I think Michigan's got a really good chance of getting up to the second level and neutralizing those guys and leading to those big gains against Ohio State.
Well, because they're not running the ball, they're not playing complementary football. And you mentioned the defensive backfield. They have been, God bless them, Michael, they've been an NFL farm team in the secondary for the last 4 or 5 years. But the problem is...
Isn't there one team out there that has 4 starting defensive backs that are all from Ohio State? It might be New Orleans right now,
Yeah, the Saints with the trade of Eli Apple. Yeah, so...
that's one of the more
crazy
things I've heard. Yeah.
Well, what's happened, though, even as well as they recruit, when you're Ohio State or LSU or Alabama, it's not the amount of guys you lose early to the draft. It's when they cluster at one position 2 years in a row. And so 2 years in a row, they lost their entire secondary early to the NFL draft. And now they're kind of in a position where Kendall Sheffield, a 5-star recruit, is kind of playing a year before he's ready, Similar to what we had to do with some guys last year. Donovan Peoples-Jones had to be a number 1 receiver a year before he was really ready to play that role. And so now, even as well as they recruit, their secondary guys are all kind of moving up a stretch because they've just had cluster early entrance there. And I was listening to the argument you were having with your partner at 24/7 Sports, Zach Shaw, today, talking about Michigan's offensive underutilization. I think you and I would both agree the play calling could be more aggressive at times. But if I were in your studio, I'd have looked at Zach and I said, Zach, you kind of want Michigan to play the way Ohio State's playing. which is not complimentary football. And so, yeah, they're throwing all over the yard. They got these 2 or 3 play drives, and then their defense is right back out there on the field for 75, 80 snaps. And we've got a defense even as great as our defense is, you don't want them out there on the field that long. So when you know the other team is simply, if you put them on a long field, is not going to score 21 points if you make them drive 70 yards against this defense to do so, why would you go out there and chuck and duck 40 times a game when you don't need it? Why wouldn't you play complementary football? So I agree Michigan's play calling, particularly in the red zone, needs to be more aggressive. Agree with you. Shea needs to be willing to give those big, tall receivers more of a 50-50 chance. But I wouldn't change the overall structure of the offense at all when you can play defense like that. Then you're making the mistake Ohio State's making this year.
Yeah, it's Steve. I think these arguments are pretty funny because through the entire Rich Rodriguez era, Michigan was putting up big numbers, except against teams that had a pulse of a defense, and then all of a sudden the offense would go away. And what would we always sit there and talk about? Well, if only they had a defense, and maybe they should do things differently with their offense and not try to run hurry up and not try to run the spread, just so that they can give their defense more of a rest. And now they have a great defense, and they have what seems to be a running game that is effective at controlling the clock. And all we're sitting there saying is, like, well, why aren't they a more explosive offense, throwing the ball down the field and doing all those things? Sorry, as I got a little loud in here, as people are screaming across the bar I'm at here. But no, I like what Michigan's offense is. I like that we've been begging for them to establish the running game, begging for them to be able to control the clock. And now they can do that. So I'm not going to complain that they're not putting up 49 points per game. Is it going to work against the big boys on the calendar? Well, I certainly hope that Michigan finds themselves in a college football playoff in a couple of weeks, going up against an Oklahoma or a Clemson and saying, hey, look, we're going to pit our number 1 ranked defense and see if it can slow you down and win this game 28-24. I think that's what Jim Harbaugh's trying to do. Is this unconventional? Yes, it is. And considering that you look around college football, you look at Oklahoma, you look at the way the Pac-12, the Big 12 run their offenses. You look at the SEC, and it's all about offense. And this is what we're seeing in the NFL too. It's all about, like, how can you outscore your opposition? But looking at some of those numbers a little more closely, I mean, I think it's the last 4 national champions, Alabama, Clemson, and is it Ohio State still that's in that group, or is that 1 year before then? But I think the last 4 national champions, when you look at it, are all teams that have ranked in the top 10 or at the very least top 15 nationally in total defense and scoring defense. And so we can talk all we want about how awesome it would be if Shea Patterson had 3,000 yards passing already, and Donovan Peoples-Jones and Nico Collins both had 70 catches and 1,000 yards, and Karan Higdon had 1,500 yards rushing already. But if it comes at the expense of having a great defense, then what's the point? I still think that defense can neutralize a great offense. And Jim Harbaugh wants to win. He wants to beat Penn State this weekend. He wants to beat Ohio State in a couple of weeks. He wants to win a Big Ten championship game, and he wants to win a college football playoff game, like the score of 28-17, 28-21. And honestly, by looking at what this defense has across the board, I think they can do it.
So as we close this out, let's go back to Penn State, this week's opponent. What I think is fascinating is they kind of remind me a lot of the team they've been the last couple of years. They just don't have Saquon Barkley, Mike Gesicki, Deshaun Hamilton, meaning they Saquon Barkley was having 4 touchdown games where he had 59 yards on 20 rushes. They haven't really been a high efficiency team. They've been kind of a big play, all or nothing team on both sides of the ball. I think the reason Trace McSorley's passing numbers are down efficiency-wise is he's built a lot of his rep on 50-50 balls. We saw this against them when we played them last year. And now they don't have the guys. Juwan Johnson's been a disappointment. They haven't really found a replacement for Gesicki. They're kind of struggling to make those one-on-one plays they've made the last couple of years. So I think it kind of comes down to this. If Michigan makes it a conventional football game, I think they're so superior in the line of scrimmage, I don't think there's any way Penn State will win. But if this is where I do agree with Zach a little bit, if Michigan is not more aggressive in the red zone, and they make Penn State only have to come up with 2 or 3 big plays as opposed to 4 or 5 to win the game, then I think they could let this one slip away. I kind of see Penn State as a more talented version of Maryland in that respect, in that they're kind of a feast or famine kind of a football team. But how do you see the game on Saturday?
I think you make a couple of good arguments, and really for me, it's that red zone touchdown efficiency rate, which Michigan does not rank very well this year. I think they're in the 60s in terms of touchdown conversion percentage so far this year. And I think that's my biggest beef. The play calling to me does not bother me between the 20s. It bothers me once they get inside the 20-yard line. I think there's we've seen very, very few jump balls this year. We've seen a couple of back shoulder fades to Donovan Peoples-Jones and to Grant Perry, but we have not seen them throw the ball up there to Zach Gentry, to Nico Collins in a jump ball situation. We don't see them run a crossing route. I think that they're so afraid of getting picked off when they can come away with 3 points that they've done a lot of first and second down running, and then they put themselves in a bad situation on third down. And so I'd like to see a little more, a little bit better play calling, a little more, I don't want to say take risks, but certainly just give your big playmakers a chance to make some of those plays in the red zone. And if that happens and Michigan scores, if they're in the red zone 5 times on Saturday, they need to score touchdowns on 4 of them. They score touchdowns on 4 of them. I think Michigan wins this game pretty comfortably because they do still have some of the big play potential. But I agree with you. I think this is a game where Michigan's defense is ready to feast on Trace McSorley, and you don't have to worry about the 50-50 balls that they've lost in the past. I don't think that the safeties are going to be the liability that they were a year ago. And if it really comes down to just Michigan's front 7 against Penn State's offensive line and their running game, I really like Michigan's chances. I haven't made a prediction yet this week. It's only Tuesday, but I'm at the moment looking at something like 28-17, maybe 28-21. I'm not going to put any field goals on the board for Michigan because I have no faith right now in Quinn Nordin, and that's the one thing that's going to change this game a little bit too. And maybe it makes Jim Harbaugh and his play count a little more aggressive in the red zone, because I don't think you can count on, hey, we're at the 15-yard line and we're going to kick a 32-yard field goal the way that he's kicking a football right now.
Real quick, Tariq Black scores a touchdown. Rashawn Gary plays. Which of those do you think is more likely? You think both of them are possible, or do you think neither one?
I think it's more likely that Tariq Black scores a touchdown than Rashawn Gary plays this weekend. I know we're at the 5-week mark since he hurt himself against Northwestern. His mom said it was going to be 4 to 6 weeks. He's coming off the bye, and maybe he didn't play at all, didn't practice at all, didn't do anything physical at all with Michigan the last week and a half. But I think it's more likely, based off of where they were 2 weeks ago, that Tariq Black comes back and they look to get him the ball in a certain situation. Maybe he's the guy that they feel completely comfortable with on those jump balls. Because I will say the one thing about the jump balls is at what point this year have you seen Michigan wide receiver win a jump ball? Even in that game against Michigan State, there was a deep ball thrown in the middle of the field to Donovan Peoples-Jones that got knocked down and was a little bit underthrown, yes, but you didn't see him go up there and try to make a play on it. Zach Gentry hasn't come down with the jump ball, and so maybe when Tariq Black comes back, that's the guy that they feel comfortable with throwing the ball up in the air to. But I think it's much more likely that Black is back, and we have to wait another week, maybe 2 weeks, till the Indiana game till we see Rashawn Gary.
And I know, people are wondering, hey, Sam Ehlinger at Texas has the same AV injury, and he came back in 3 weeks. Where's Rashawn? One thing we should point out is Sam set out 3 weeks after his original injury. My understanding is Rashawn has actually tried playing with this injury for several weeks, and then so he was probably re-aggravating it or irritating it and not allowing it to heal. So it's a little bit different situation, I think, than the Texas quarterback. Is that your read as well, Michael?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And here's the other thing, too, is that the post that his mother made on Facebook is a little bit vague, right? Because she says that he needs to rest 4 to 6 weeks, but she doesn't actually say when that 4 to 6 weeks of rest began.
Right.
And so, because I'd gotten reports that he was practicing full go the week of Michigan State to give it a go, and then he got hurt again. And so if we're talking 4 to 6 weeks from Michigan State, then we're missing the season. And we're not seeing him until, a college football playoff or a bowl game. If we're talking 4 to 6 weeks from the Northwestern game, then we could see him this weekend or next weekend. So I hope that we're talking about from the Northwestern game, because I would love to see him come back and make an impact. And, 2 years ago, or actually, I'm sorry, not even 2 years ago, last year, his best game of his career is the Ohio State game last year.
Yeah.
And I do think that he is a big game player that would come to play and be, at his peak against against Penn State, against Ohio State, and I would love to see him out there at least one more time in a maize and blue uniform with that winged helmet on in front of the home crowd. If he decides to shut it down, and you and I talked about this last week, and while we may not agree with the philosophy, if he decides to shut it down, he's a Michigan guy. We'll support him. We'll wish the very best for him. But I want to see him in that winged helmet at least one more time.
Michael Spath from Wolverine Digest, WTKA, Ann Arbor. Good to see you, brother. Talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Go Blue. If you want to keep up with what we think about the Wolverines all week long, aside from when we're doing this for Michigan Podcast, check us out at WolverineDigest.com or Wolverine Maven, part of the Maven Network, WolverineDigest.com. Myself and Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor, we keep you up to date with our commentary all week long. And one of the really cool things I love about how this site works is that the sidebar there where we can give you, almost like a Mike Florio does at Pro Football Talk, where you can give you little mini updates via Twitter and other interactions, things that you probably want to know, be aware of, but don't require 500 to 700 word columns. I love that part of our website. It's a really easy, functional website to follow, WolverineDigest.com. This week's Twitter poll question we asked you, do you think a 2-loss Michigan, if it wins the Big Ten title, would make the college football playoff? Wow, 89% of you said no. And I don't think it's that definitive at all. And I'll explain why here in a few seconds. But first, these are my bowl projections based on how I think the season's going to end in the Big Ten right now. I've got Michigan going to the Cotton Bowl in the college football playoff. I've got Ohio State as the second team out of the Big Ten. They would get the Rose Bowl slot in that scenario. Iowa in the Citrus Bowl. Apparently the Citrus Bowl has basically lived in Iowa City the last few weeks. Penn State to the Outback Bowl. Holiday Bowl to Purdue. Wisconsin to the artist formerly known as the Gator Bowl, which they should call themselves that again because it's much better than Tax Slayer. Michigan State to the Pinstripe Bowl, which I think is really underrated. I wouldn't want to live there. I love visiting New York. It's a great city, Christmas time. I don't know why this is such a mocked bowl game. I mean, if you weren't going to be in a major bowl game, what better destination would there be than going to New York City at Christmas? Northwestern out to San Francisco, and Maryland to the Quick Lane Bowl is how I project Big Ten bowl predictions heading in to November. This week's question of the week comes from Derek DeVries. He says, hey, didn't you have a crystal ball prediction before the year about a 2-loss team getting into the college football playoff? How are you feeling about that now? So I think this idea that Ohio State didn't get into the college football playoff last year because it had 2 losses is erroneous. Because Auburn went into the final week of the season, number 2 in the college football playoff rankings, and it had 2 losses. Which means if Auburn had beaten Georgia in the SEC championship game, as it was actually favored to do, Auburn would have been in the playoff with 2 losses. Ohio State did not get bypassed last year because it had 2 losses. It got bypassed last year because it lost both of those games by double digits, and the other team was called Alabama. See, I don't even think it was like an SEC bias. I think it was Alabama has sort of earned the nod that, they're just better than everybody else until proven otherwise. And then, of course, a bunch of people complained when they got in over Ohio State, and then they went in and won the whole dang thing, proving the point. So I don't think it was SEC bias. I think it was Alabama's earned the biggest benefit of the doubt in the history of college football. And I don't think Ohio State was left out because they lost 2 games. They were left out because the 2 games they lost, Oklahoma and Iowa, they were shellacked in both of them. Meanwhile, Auburn with 2 losses, if it had won the SEC championship game, was going to go to the college football playoff. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility at all. Like, let's say this scenario happens. Michigan loses to Penn State on Saturday and then wins out and beats Ohio State and then wins the Big Ten championship. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Michigan's just automatically out because they have 2 losses. Do I think a 1-loss Big 12 champ would be picked over a 2-loss Big Ten champion? More than likely, I do. But keep in mind, we just talked at the top of the show this week, comparing this to the season in 2016. Michigan had 2 losses and didn't even win its division, and it was still in the conversation for the 4th slot in the college football playoff until the very end of 2016. So the 2-loss thing is not the instant barrier that a lot of people think it is. That's all urban legend. As the great prophet Flavor Flav once said, don't believe the hype. Want to thank all of you who tuned in this week to our episode of Michigan Podcast via YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, etc. If you could leave us positive reviews, we would appreciate it. Don't lie if you don't like us, but if you do, those really help. Make sure you subscribe as well. Give us a like. Those help too. Follow us on Twitter all week long at Michigan Podcast for our thoughts on Michigan and other Big Ten related sporting events. You can also check us out online every day at WolverineDigest.com. Want to thank our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast for helping us spread the word as well. Until next week, go Blue.